Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third meeting of 2025 of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee. I have received no apologies for today's meeting. Moving to agenda item 1, today the committee will take evidence from the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, and I'm very pleased to welcome Rosemary Agnew, the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, to today's committee. We move directly to questions, and the first one is from me, and it's quite a general one, but we'd be interested, first of all, if you could set out what you consider to be the role of SPSO, and how does this differ from the role of ministers, MSPs and other public bodies?
Gosh, we've only got 45 minutes. Okay, so as an ombudsman, I have quite an unusual collection of duties. So there's the traditional, what you'd expect of an ombudsman. I'm the final stage for complaints about public bodies under my jurisdiction, which includes the Parliament and the corporate part of the Parliament and the Scottish Government. My second broad set of duties is I'm the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer for the NHS in Scotland. That is a uniquely Scottish role, and that is a combination of the final stage of the handling of whistleblowing concerns, but there's also a standard setting, which I'll come to. We are the review stage for the Scottish Welfare Fund, so that is the local authority administered welfare fund, and we are effectively the appeal route for crisis grants and what have you. So that is where we can overturn decisions, give feedback. And then the third set of duties, which is probably the smallest in terms of resources, but is the area that often has a huge impact, is we set complaint handling standards and principles. These are laid before Parliament, so they're approved by Parliament, and with them go model complaint handling procedures. Very broadly, anybody under jurisdiction is following a model complaints handling procedure. Now, that team also includes communications, provides an advice service for public bodies on complaint handling, training, advice, data monitoring, so those sort of functions. And then underpinning all of this, like every other public body, we have statutory duties to do things like climate change and employment and what have you. Now, I would say fundamentally the biggest difference between MSPs and myself is I'm appointed, I'm not voted into office. I'm appointed through a Crown appointment via the Parliament, which you're all familiar with. But I also, my decision-making in relation to complaints, in relation to complaint handling, is completely independent. You obviously don't operate in a vacuum, but that my decisions or decisions taken under my delegated authority. The same is applicable to Welfare Fund, to the whistleblowing. Now, there is, you could feasibly say, some overlap, because I'm aware of my contact with MSPs that you're also asked to look into things for constituents. The big difference is that my powers include the ability to require information, and I can go all the way to the Court of Session for that. That is something that means we can look at things in detail. We can get all of the information we need, which sometimes I think if you're doing it more of an advocacy way, you're unable to do. In terms of how I differ from ministers, I think it is very much the same thing, but I'm also not a policy maker, like ministers will be policy makers, but I would contribute data or learning or things that I know, or share themes and trends with ministers if I thought there was something emerging from our complaint handling. I hope that's enough of a run through.
It's very helpful and succinct, and of course, those of us around the table in Parliament are aware of what you've said, but for our inquiry and our work, it's helpful to get that on the record. And of course, the origins of the organisation are interesting, looking back to the beginning of devolution and the fact that there was a local government ombudsman, a health service ombudsman, and a housing association ombudsman, and in time those came together. I mean, how do you as an organisation find operating across, you know, principally or not principally, but in many cases with regard to local government, whether that's the welfare fund or some of the issues that you're looking into, but then also, of course, your function with regard to whistleblowing in the NHS across different policy areas. And just be interested in any further comment in terms of public trust that you might want to give about that.
I think the welfare fund is probably a good place to start, because the service we deliver is very much under the Scottish Government statutory guidance, guidance that local authorities are following. So that's very much about making sure that they've followed the guidance and followed it appropriately, and you've got good decision making. And we can overturn and ask for awards to be made. The whistleblowing, I think, is an area where the trust is building, and I don't think that's just trust in us. I think it's trust in whistleblowing in the NHS, and that's very much a cultural thing, and I think we have a leadership role in that, and part of that is about ensuring that we follow our own guidance on things like confidentiality and the way information is shared. It's a very tricky balance between transparency and confidentiality. So we actually have separate handling standards for whistleblowing, and that is within one sector, effectively within health. I think in terms of public service complaints, which is the housing, the local authority, even within local authority there are lots of functions, and health, it's not really been an issue or a challenge. Fundamentally, we have to make sure we have good complaint processes ourselves. So the investigatory skills are really important. We also, particularly for things like health or planning, I have a pool of contractors who are experts in their field. So if we need technical advice, then we have access to technical advice. They're not decision makers. We will take that as evidence with other things. But I think that's a really critical part, particularly for clinical cases where you do need that level of expertise. What I would say is where the expertise lies with my team is they're very good at asking questions and weighing and balancing evidence. Is that enough? Or
that's really helpful context. Thank you very much, and that leads us nicely to questions from my colleague Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'll go on to my question in a minute. I was very taken with what you said about how you have the right to require information from bodies, including Scottish Government. As opposition members of Parliament will feel very jealous that you have that power and we don't. Although my former ministerial colleagues around the table might take a different view on that matter. What I wanted to ask you about was this issue of the setting criteria for creating new supported bodies. And that's, I suppose, one of the primary reasons this committee was established, looking at demands there are, and as you know, there are in the parliamentary pipeline a number of proposals to establish new commissioners, and whether or not that provides good value for money as the Finance and Public Public Administration Committee, thank you, Richard, concluded in their report, whether that's an appropriate way to proceed in the public sector landscape. And I read your submission, and you made some interesting comments around how the current criteria for creating new supported bodies might be enhanced, including the need for a demonstrable gap in service or oversight. So can I just ask you to explain a little bit and put that on the record as to how you think the criteria could be amended?
I think it is about starting with the end point, about what's needed to be achieved, rather than we've had a lot of concern about this area. If there are areas where we're under-resourced, and if we were resourced or had different legislation, we would be doing more. So I think there is often a risk that it's a reaction to where things that already exist are not working as well as they might, for whatever reason. That's not a critical comment, it's just a comment. And we tend to try and address that problem, whereas I think criteria that are based around clear gap analysis, what is it that is the issue? Are we needing to actually invest a much more modest amount in existing oversight bodies? And I don't just mean office holders in that, actually, it's other oversight bodies. Do we need to amend existing organisations' remits slightly? Because you do that, you're not creating a whole administration, you're not creating a whole corporate entity. Or is there genuinely a gap that will not fit with these other organisations? And it's the gap that you fill. But I think the other criteria that need to come into this are about also checking the ability of others to work with the new body, because one of the areas that I think our legislation is really needing a good look at is in information sharing powers with other organisations, because a lot of the things that need covering we would cover collectively in a different way if we could work differently. So back to this criteria, I think the original criteria, the hearts and minds type ones, are really important, but there does need to be a good hard look at what are you trying to achieve for public service, and particularly for public service users, that is not currently being delivered either at all or to the required standard.
Thank you. And I think that answer just goes to the heart of exactly why this committee has been established, and that's very much the root of our discussions as we look at these issues. Maybe I could just follow that on by taking a specific example, which is the Patient Safety Commissioner. Now, I was on the train this morning listening to Good Morning Scotland, and I learned from that that apparently the latest round of recruitment for the Patient Safety Commissioner has been unsuccessful, and this is the second attempt to recruit someone to that job. I'm a bit surprised by that. It sounds a very attractive salary and attractive package, but apparently it's not worked. And even though someone was identified through the process and offered the position, for whatever reason they've turned it down, and the Parliament's corporate body, I think, has had to take that back and will look again. So clearly there's an issue there. Now, the FPAC committee suggested that if the existing criteria had been properly followed, in fact, a Patient Safety Commissioner would not have been established. And they suggested that that Commissioner could have sat within your office, SPSO. I'm just interested to get your thoughts on that, whether your office could have accommodated that rather than try and create a new office where we can't even find someone to do the job.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I suppose you're probably aware I'm demitting office. I've done my 8 years at the end of April. I'll try not to get too upset, but I think that in a way enables me to say things maybe quite forthrightly.
Please do. Yes.
So I would tend to agree with the gist of that, because I was also part of the consultation for the Patient Safety Commissioner, and I think reflecting back on that experience, it was a really good example of where it was, we want this, and it has to be independent. And I completely understand that, but that's perhaps another criteria. parliamentary office holders are not the only way of creating independence. You can create independence through non-departmental public bodies. But fundamentally, when you start looking at what Patient Safety Commissioner would do, there were so many areas where they either slightly overlapped or abutted right up to what other NDPBs and office holders did. My conclusion, my personal conclusion was, if you'd given the Ombudsman own initiative powers to go and investigate an issue in the public interest, rather than having to wait for a complaint, you would have plugged the gap that was there.
Interesting, thank you. And as you're stepping down as SPSO, you didn't think about applying for the job yourself?
I couldn't possibly comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Murdo Fraser. Just in the same area, before I go to Lorna Slater, there's a proposal before Parliament in a current bill that my other committee, the Criminal Justice Committee, is considering, which has there's been discourse, of course, in Parliament and beyond on a victims commissioner. Is that, if you were inclined to speak in similarly candid terms with your experience and understanding, is that an area that you as an ombudsman could potentially encompass as well?
You can potentially encompass anything and make it work. I think with the Victims Commissioner, it's coming from a slightly different place. And the similarities are that it starts with people. And if people are not getting the support they need from existing organisations, then somebody has to be held to account. And actually an ombudsman model is a very good way of holding people to account. The one thing I would say, drawing on the experience of whistleblowing, though, is there does come a point where you can add too many things on and you end up with silos that of themselves overall achieve well, but you're almost recreating mini organisations. So I think there has to be some form of close scrutiny of the sector in which it's sitting. Because bear in mind, I don't have any jurisdiction over the police. I don't have any jurisdiction other than, at a very sort of high level of Crown Office and Prosecution Services. I do have prisons in my jurisdiction, but I don't know that the underlying issues that need to be looked at would sit as comfortably. That doesn't mean it has to be a Victims Commissioner, but I think the same questions about, is there another organisation where it can sit? Because in many ways it's very much a rights-based thing. Mm-hmm. So I think I would be looking at that about somewhere. I'm not entirely certain it would fit well with us. The one thing that I can say is my office had actually vacated part of Bridgeside House, where a number of commissioners are. We'd already created accommodation space on the basis that there would be 2 more commissioners coming in, and we'd already put in place through the service, a shared service we provide to other office holders on some of the corporate administrative type things, an expectation that we would be at least providing that shared service to them.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Lorna Slater.
Thank you very much. I'm really interested in what you're saying. I think it's really useful, and thank you so much for being so candid with us. You mentioned in your opening remarks that some of your work is similar to the casework that MSPs undertake when supporting our constituents. So in that sense, I suppose we can imagine the Ombudsman is facing in the same direction as Parliament, which is holding government and public services to account, supporting people with their interactions with them. You also report to Parliament. So do you see yourself as a sort of extension of the capabilities of Parliament, or how do you see where you fit into the wider landscape and structure of public trust?
I don't think that I sit within the structure of Parliament. As I'm accountable through Parliament, and I like to think I'm accountable to the citizens of Scotland through Parliament, through the elected members who represent them. I have no issue with being accountable through the committees. I think it's worked very well for the SPSO and for the accountability of the SPSO. Where I think we sit is quite rightly outside of all of those structures. So you can take a very different look at the way a complaint is handled. I don't get that many complaints about the Parliament, it has to be said. But if you're looking at complaints about government, for example, what you're looking at is how they are responding to citizens independently. And I think it's that almost outsidedness that is the really valuable thing about a parliamentary office holder. But I don't think that level of independence is necessarily always required to be through a parliamentary office holder. I'm reflecting on being with the Legal Complaints Commission. That was a non-departmental public body, but it was independent of government in the way it operated in its decision-making. I think where sometimes there is a bit of an overlap is, as an accountable officer, I am accountable in the same way as any other public body. And I have to say some of the budget negotiations and discussions, there's often a bit of a disconnect between the delivery and performance of our statutory functions. And I think that budgetary side is probably where the relationship with the corporate body is very important. But in terms of this similarity for, holding people to account, I think we all hold people to account in a slightly different way. And it's that triangulation and holistic holding to account that I think is the important thing we achieve between us with our relative functions and independence.
I'm interested in what you just said, suggested there when you said you don't get a lot of complaints about Parliament. We have had colleagues in from the Ethical Standards Commission and the Standards Commission, and they get quite a lot of them. So that's an interesting point, that there are, and I think this is a large part of what we're discussing, is there are different places to go depending on who you want to complain about, but clearly there is some overlap if you could bring that complaint to more than one of those places. Yeah,
and what you want to complain about, because I think the difference between us and the Ethical Standards Commission is a really good example, because I don't look at the conduct of elected members. The Ethical Standards Commissioner looks at the conduct. So jurisdictionally, I couldn't do it anyway. That is, I think, as well, the other difference between myself and perhaps MSPs who are supporting constituents is it's not really an advocacy role that I perform, and there are very clear jurisdictional restrictions around it. But I think that what the Ethical Standards Commissioner example shows is that in reality, the parliamentary supported bodies all perform a different function, which holistically we're looking at different things from a different perspective. And for myself, because Ombudsman traditionally viewed as being part of the alternative dispute resolution, personally don't like the word alternative, it should just be dispute resolution. But a lot of our complaint work is focused on an individual. Now, without own initiative powers, we can pass on, we've seen a trend in this, we've seen a trend in that. And I think one of the temptations is often to think, well, if they're all doing things that are a bit similar, if we all look at Parliament, we can all sit together. I think you have to start, it's almost like this gap analysis thing again. Are all the gaps being filled? Because then the next question is there a more efficient model? And efficient is not necessarily the same as making sure all the bases are covered. I don't know if that sort of answers with more
absolutely, and it leads me into my next question, which is exactly on that point, which is, I mean, this inquiry has been prompted about a concern about proliferation of commissioners with overlaps and gaps. And so helping to understand the current landscape so that we can identify those gaps, but also identify overlaps and inefficiencies, not to get rid of them just for the sake of efficiency, but for the sake of effectiveness. So you've already made a suggestion as to how a gap in patient safety could have been filled. Are you aware of other overlaps and gaps that maybe we're not?
Not so much with the parliamentary office holders, because we're set up to be very different entities. I think one of the things that, and I don't envy you your job in this, that makes it more complex is you can't really look, I don't think, at, say, an ombudsman or some of the other organisations without looking at the wider oversight and scrutiny landscape. So I, as a stakeholder, as people that I engage with, it's people like Health Improvement Scotland, where Health Improvement Scotland can, in theory, take whistleblowing concerns, but we make it work. If it's, we keep each other informed as far as we can. I don't take anonymous concerns, so we work the signposting out between us. I think what I would be more interested in at this point is the things that enable or restrict the ability to work together differently. So if I identify a theme or a trend through complaints work, I might not be able to look at it. But even if I had own initiative powers, I might be able to get another organisation or an office holder to do something jointly. Or I might be able to or want to hand over more information than I actually can. So I think I would be looking at some of the underlying elements of our legislation, wider than office holders, about enabling us to work together. And I think if you ask the office holders, we'd probably be able to give you a pretty good list of what would help us work with other organisations, still independently. And I think that's the critical bit. Our decision making is our decision. But some of the enabling things really do need to be looked at. And I think I've pretty much been saying this for a few years in terms of my own legislation now.
That's really, really helpful. One last question for me. So this is looking at the kind of customer experience and someone who wants to make a complaint. There's quite a complicated landscape as to who to go to if you want to whistleblow, if you want to complain about a parliamentarian, and so on and so on. Something we've discussed with previous witnesses is a sort of one-stop shop for complaints, or imagining it hypothetically as a sort of umbrella office of public trust, and it doesn't matter what's gone wrong, you have one place to go. And then within that organisation, it would combine all the action of the ombudsman and the whistleblowing. You know, all these things would be in one place. What does that look like to you in terms of a hypothetical one-stop shop as an office of public trust that combines some of these functions?
I think I'll probably come at it from two angles. One is about accessibility, because it's not just the parliamentary office holders. There are all sorts of organisations, you know. If you want to complain about care, do you come to us or the Care Inspectorate? Well, actually, it doesn't matter which one you come to. We will signpost you the right way. We almost act as a mini portal. And that is true of our frontline services. They're very good at signposting and what have you. Now, in terms of putting them all together, I would never say never, but I think it would require some really, really strong feasibility, because what you'd effectively be doing is creating almost like I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's a bit like a large corporation. They might have several businesses that sit below them, and I'm not entirely sure, without having looked in more detail, about whether that would actually achieve anything better for service users. I think the support things like accessibility, advocacy, because advocacy and support, not just for making complaints. If you want to make a complaint about a health service, there's patient advisory services, and I think they do a fantastic job and it works really well. And once you're in the system, you tend to get signposted to the right place. I'm more concerned about people in vulnerable situations who never complain, and I don't think that a single entity would necessarily alter that, because there may be different reasons why people are not accessing complaint systems, but more critically why they're not accessing the public services that they should be accessing in the first place. And it's something that was discussed a lot during the consultation on the National Care Service. And I think one of the recognitions was advocacy is so patchy across Scotland, and it's giving people support, I think, rather than a single point of contact. That said, in terms of the parliamentary office holders, what might be helpful is, if you don't know about us, just like on Parliament's website there's a committee page, have a parliamentary office holders page, so at least they can identify if it's us or ethical standards fairly quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. Really helpful questions and responses. Now turn to Richard Leonard for your questions. Thanks, Richard.
Convener, good morning. You've mentioned already a couple of times about powers, and you've spoken about the benefit there may be if you had more information sharing powers, and you've also alluded to own initiative powers. You notably told the Finance and Public Administration Committee on the 30th of April last year, and let me quote you, we are not doing the job we think we should be doing because we do not have the right legislative remit. Do you want to elaborate on what you meant by that, and is it about those powers of own initiative? Is it about information sharing? Is it more than that?
I think it's a combination of all three. We are doing the job that we want to do, but we think we can do more is probably a better way of doing it. And I'll use the own initiative powers as the example. I can go and do research, if I had enough resource to do it, on any subject I like. What own initiative powers gives you, and I'm drawing on the experience of my fellow ombudsmen in Northern Ireland and Wales, who already have these powers, is that you can take a different approach to what you investigate, in that you can identify things through themes and trends, or through some really obvious things like, I never get complaints from that demographic. Why am I not getting complaints? Now, the difference between own initiative powers and researching something is with the powers come the information requiring powers. So, you know, if I look at it from if I were a researcher point of view, I could look at something that affected or I thought was an issue across all NHS boards. I could make use of freedom of information legislation, but it still wouldn't get me everything I needed, because you'd need sensitive data. Own initiative would enable you to look at things that go across services. Now, I can follow a complaint to the extent that if it brings up something else, I can follow that. But what I couldn't do at the moment is, let's say I made a finding against a local authority of a significant issue in relation to children's services. And I'm thinking, that might exist across all local authorities. I can't go and look at that. And I think that's the element that as Ombudsman we've fallen behind on. If I look at my European colleagues, for example, they do much less in terms of individual complaint handling. I wouldn't want to lose that, because I think the personal redress is really vital. But they can achieve wide impact with one investigation. And it's that, I think, that I would dearly love for my organisation, whether I'm there or not.
That's interesting, because one of the questions that we're asking people sitting where you're sitting when they appear before us is, to what extent are you reactive and to what extent are you proactive?
We are, if you have a balance, we are more reactive than proactive. But within the powers we have, we are getting a lot more proactive than we were. So the reactive bit is reacting to complaints. Any organisation that is volume-based you get complaints, then you are reacting to them. Now, where the proactive bit comes in is in relation to complaint handling standards. We can be differently reactive because over the last 10 years, complaint handling at the local level has improved. I mean, we can point you in the direction of things that we see. We can't always, because of our reporting powers, tell you about them, but we see some really good complaint handling practice, which makes us more efficient at the other end of that process. So the proactive bit is about driving standards. But we're also increasingly looking at the whether we can and how we can make better use of our own data. So we're in the second year of a data strategy, and what we are looking at is triangulating our data, triangulating it with others, but trying to see where there are themes where we can report without having to have the own initiative powers. A good example recently was the report we did on the spotlight on the welfare fund and high most compelling. And I think that's the proactive bit. It's the most under-resourced bit of my organisation, but I think if you can imagine being able to do something like that spotlight report and get really under the skin of something, that's the really proactive bit that we just can't quite achieve yet.
Okay. I mean, you've got powers, haven't you, of statutory investigation. Do you have powers of statutory enforcement?
No, and it's not something I would seek.
Sorry, it's not something you would seek?
No, and I'm very happy to explain why. I'm looking at, I have lucky enough to have had the experience of being the Information Commissioner as well,
yeah.
And they do have statutory enforcement. Now, very often, we will always look to see if we can't resolve a complaint, because it's better for everybody if a complaint is resolved, as long as we capture learning. But at the end of the process, if we make a finding, we will make a recommendation. And the way we make recommendations is actually slightly different to other ombudsmen. We'll make a finding, then define an outcome that we think needs to be achieved, and then we'll ask for the evidence to show that the outcome is being achieved, or that there is work progressing to do that. Now, when we make findings, we share them in draft form with both parties. So there is a chance for public bodies, if they want to say, we can't argue with your finding, that's your finding, but there may be a better way of delivering an outcome. We're always open to that, because ultimately it's about delivery for the person and that wider public service. Now, I can put a special report before Parliament if there is unremedied injustice because a recommendation hasn't been implemented, or if I have other concerns, say about complaint handling, I can do something on that. Neither I nor my predecessors have ever had to do that. I've come close a couple of times, but actually, by not making it enforceable, you're able to write your recommendations in such a way as to achieve something wider and more human-faced than perhaps something that you haven't required with legislation or policy. And I think to lose that would be losing a great deal, because it also enables us to be able to track where we might think people need support. We have a support and intervention policy that underpins a lot of these. So where we identify a theme, we might be able to provide some extra support, training, advice. And I think if you were to have truly enforcement powers, you become a regulator rather than an ombudsman, in my view.
Okay, and I was going to ask about the extent to which you see yourself as being regulatory or an advocacy agent.
I don't think we're either. I think we're an ombudsman.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. But could I just take you back to your previous answer? Because doesn't that situation get us into events like the recent controversy about the recommendations over the WASPI women at a UK level, where the parliamentary and health ombudsman there made a recommendation around maladministration by the DWP and called for universal compensation payments to be made. And, of course, to their shame, the Labour government has decided not to pay out compensation but simply to issue an apology.
There is a huge difference in our relative positions. I would say we have a professional relationship with public bodies. That particular recommendation, Ombudsman, and I'm very, very dear to my heart, we know we operate in a political environment, but we're apolitical. That particular recommendation, I think, we focus on learning and improvement and personal redress, but our complaints are from individuals. So I'm not sure that I would even have been able to make the same type of recommendation in the same way. As to it not being fulfilled, I think that is probably straying into politics rather than ombudsman in many ways. Because if I'd had an unfulfilled recommendation, whether it was over the front of the newspapers or not, I would still be reporting to Parliament, and it would become a parliamentary issue rather than a party government issue. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and we're allowed to comment on that, but I recognise you may not be. Can I just turn to a couple of more technical questions, which I hope you'll be able to answer in full. One is, I think you've said about there are issues around measurement and reporting mechanisms. So our question really is, what are the gaps in the current reporting mechanisms that you use, and are there obstacles that you've identified, and how are you, as the Ombudsman, addressing those?
I mean, the things that we do publish, if you like, and measure, the obvious things that any organisation, volume-based, would. I think what, for me, the gaps come in some of those wider issues of information about the good things we find, the things that work well. We sometimes have to pick our way through how we can do that. In terms of measuring it, it's not really an issue to measure in the sense of capturing our own data. I think because of the environment which we operate in our wide jurisdiction, this is also a wider public sector question as well about, are we collectively using data and information well? In terms of casework, I think some of the things that I would like to be able to perhaps share more information about, and this is the technical bit, and it's something that has been it's a communication challenge as much as anything. Technically, under my legislation, there is a starting point for an investigation. I have served notice on the public body concerned, and this was in place before model complaints handling, which I think is part of the issue. So it's technically not called an investigation until that point, and I have issued a decision. That's fine. We can, draw a lot from that. But many of our cases are not technically investigated. In the everyday sense of the word, there's a huge amount of work goes into them. We don't just take things on face value. We test it. We will often get, if it's health-related, advice. But we can't share a lot of the things from that in quite the same way. And I think it's about, in this wider sense, recognising that the world has changed considerably and data and information are an everyday thing, yet there are public bodies, ourselves included, whose legislation is based in a paper-based society. Actually, the requirement to submit a complaint in writing is a great example of that, which is something else I'd change. So I think it's about this. It's actually one of those enablers to be more proactive about things that work well, things that we find where the commentary could have a wider impact, and it's not all the doom and gloom and dissatisfied people who didn't like the answer at the end of it.
But can I be a bit more granular in my question then? You've got KPIs, key performance indicators. What are they? You've spoken about, in your written submission, qualitative indicators. What are those? You're right about benchmarking against other organisations. Which organisations, which key performance indicators do you benchmark against?
So in terms of the things we measure in key performance indicators, these are fairly traditional things that you will see all ombudsmen and other volume-based complaints bodies. The number of complaints you get, what the outcomes are, how quickly you handle them, decide them, all of those sort of things. So they're very much about the measurable ones because they are clear. You can count them, I suppose, is the best way of putting them. Now, I think where there is more of an issue, and we have a KPI type thing for all of our business areas, where there's more of an issue is measuring impact. And that is much more on the qualitative side of things. So this, I think, is about where we are saying there are other things we look at, like quality of our own work. We have internal audit. We also have a quality assurance programme. So some of our measures are things that we put in place to demonstrate that we are testing the quality of our work. We also, I think, use trends over time as measures. Where I think it's really difficult is, and it's still a dilemma, and you say, who do we benchmark against? We'll benchmark against similar organisations. We often benchmark against other ombudsman services. So an example of benchmarking against other organisations is the Information Commissioner has on their website quarterly data for all FOI activity across Scotland. So we benchmark ourselves against similar size organisations. In terms of the impact side of it, though, what we try and do is publish information. So our case summaries, our themes and trends, our annual report and financial statements is a really key one in that. But I think these qualitative things are something that we still are learning about and trying to do more. It's actually a key part of the current strategy, developing ways of showing impact. Now, we can hint at it by saying we gave advice to this many public bodies about good complaint handling. We delivered this many training courses. And whilst that is a measure of what we did, it's not necessarily a measure of the impact it had. And that's where I think it's probably a bit unrealistic for us to come up with a number-based thing, which is why the communication and the stakeholder engagement is so important.
And your performance is captured and recorded and publicly available, or is it?
Yeah, we publish all our complaint statistics. Yeah. We publish our external audit reports. We publish all of that on our website. You'd expect an ex-Information Commissioner to be publishing as much as possible.
Yes, I would expect that.
We do.
I would expect nothing less. Right, thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Convener.
Richard Leonard, did you want to ask your question about the Children's Commissioner as well?
Yeah, I mean, the other question which I was going to get to, I wasn't sure whether we had the time, but it was about the measures that you've implemented to make sure that your office functions well within the public body / commissioner landscape.
Do you mean in terms of a corporate entity or in terms of our statutory functions like complaint handling? Because those, I think, is... We all do different things.
I think it's more operational.
Right, operationally. I suppose operationally, we also have key performance indicators and therefore things like, you know, paying our suppliers in line with good practice in right number of days. We also will have, we obviously have external audit scrutiny of that. We keep our own policies and procedures under review, and I think we're very efficient at what we do. We also monitor some of those corporate things like absence rates and sickness rates, and we can compare to national public service, public sector data. Where I think there has been a shift in recent years, though, is when we, the three, now 4 commissioners were in office holders, are in Bridgeside House. So Bridgeside House has given us an opportunity to start thinking more about this shared service approach. So that is very much focused on the corporate, the accountable officer type thing. So we already provide a service like HR support, advice, recruitment, finance administration. So we do quite a lot of those sorts of things for the Human Rights Commission, Biometrics Commissioner, and obviously we've got the Bridgeside House shared service itself. Now that has some unexpected benefits as well. So we were asked about our climate change, our carbon footprint, and actually for Bridgeside House we monitor it, SPSO does for everybody. It doesn't mean it's a service at nil cost, but if I use the example of when the Biometrics Commissioner was created, you still require some corporate function because you're the budget holder and you are the decision maker, but that doesn't mean you have to do all the invoice paying on a transaction. So there's still a bit of that there, but what it means is for the small organisations, and they still currently, most of them have somebody who's multifunctional. We were of a size where we could have a dedicated HR person anyway. So the shared service, we've been able to take on HR administration at a lot less cost than it would be if all the new commissioners had done something for themselves on this. And I think the concept of that idea of shared corporate services is absolutely the right one. And it's something that as office holders, we ourselves collectively are constantly looking for things we can do. And we understand how we need to balance the things that we are accountable for versus the things we're responsible for, because the things we're accountable for have to sit with us. Now, I think one of the risks of this is that it suddenly gets viewed as a universal panacea. Oh, if there was everything shared, we're going to save loads of money. It would save money, but it wouldn't necessarily save loads of money. But then in the current climate, money's money. You know, if you can have a junior person rather than a senior person coming out of a parliamentary budget, then that has to be to everybody's benefit. I think one of the areas we probably have had the most impact, though, is in relation to shared accommodation. And this has been certainly achieved savings when it was put in place for the corporate body. But there probably needs to be a bit of a shift in thinking, because post-pandemic, we're all working hybrid. Our accommodation isn't always full all of the time. And that's perhaps one of the areas where we could think about collectively working differently as office holders. There is a question mark about, you know, was it the Information Commissioner who commented on Edinburgh City Council accommodation sitting there empty? I do think one of the things that's important to preserve in this, though, is independence of where you sit. Having all office holders together, if that was an aim of Parliament, we would still be independently together. I think once you start looking at the wider public sector accommodation, we have to be careful that visually you are not eroding some of that. It's a good one to explore, I think, this idea of
Can I just ask, just again for clarification? So I think we've been told that you've got 80 full-time equivalent staff, which is, by comparison, I think quite a large number of people in employment compared to some of these other commissions and so on. So, I mean, presumably that therefore makes some sense that you lead on things like HR functions, for example.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about shared services is that model makes sense because of concentration of expertise, but shared services don't necessarily have to sit with one office holder. They have to be shared between them, whereby one is delivering a service for, because the service is for the office holders, it's not the office holder's service. So there is, I think, a lot of sense in this idea of focus it where the expertise is. And actually, if you use HR as an example, what it means in reality is my HR manager is a qualified HR professional, a member of the CIPD. We work towards and have IIP, Investors in People status, but because of that level of expertise, that's not something necessarily you could build up in the same way if you had somebody whose job was a bit of HR, a bit of finance, a bit of building management, some of the IT, which you often have to be forced into. The other area I think that's really interesting is IT, because the cyber environment we're in, I think, is changing the game. And it's not just about technology expertise, it's also about having that level where you can afford good cyber security. Now, our approach to that is we are on the Government Scots network, and it works very well for us, but it gives us a lot of access to expertise. We effectively are buying a shared service in that way. So I think the concept is a really important one to look, but your comment about following the expertise, I think, is also a really valid aspect of that.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And just building on some of that before I bring in Ash Regan, you talked earlier about if you were able to share information across between ombudsmen and commissioners, that would be helpful. And do you want to take a minute? Okay.
No, I'm fine by then.
I just wondered if, and you may have said everything you want to say in response to my colleague Richard Leonard, but if there was anything more you wanted to add about any barriers to sharing services that might be helpful. And I was interested, I know that Richard Leonard touched on the Children's Commissioner, but also the Human Rights Commissioner, Scottish Human Rights Commissioner. I'd just be interested in how you work with them. So, for example, last week they published a bit of work about independent living, and of course that's related to local government. And I just wondered how you collaborate, and there's some overlap there, but obviously you're dealing with complaints.
Yeah.
They're more proactive and investigatory. So I'm interested in any thoughts you may have.
From the information side of things, we're always open to providing data, our learning from complaints. What we would not be able to do is provide detail of individual cases because of the requirement to investigate in private. So if they were looking at a theme, we could give anonymised examples and we could give general data. In the wider context, I think this is more about collaborative working on identified themes. And one of the things that I think we're all coming at our functions from the perspective of what they are and our lens and our strategic aims behind them. And in some ways, we're not. Might have the same title on the report, but it's a very different aspect than we would look at. I think there are potentially opportunities for individual pieces of work where we might have a common theme that we want to look into, but those would tend to be more ad hoc, and then you get into the realms of we only have a limited resource, and if my business plan is set out to do this and this year, have I got the resource to be able to abandon some of that and perhaps do some more collaborative work? We do where we can. I think where some of the discussion could take us as office holders is actually about what are your 2-year plans, your 3-year plans? Is there likely to be something down the line we can look at? And that's always been a bit of a struggle because of the cyclical annual nature of our budget. But I think we are moving down that route now. Certainly as office holders, we meet, we talk, we share things. And if we identify something that we think will be of interest, then we would raise that and share it with the other office holders and contribute what we could.
That's very helpful, and appreciate that you handle final stage complaints about the Scottish Human Rights Commission, for example, and in dealing with complaints about other SPCB supported bodies, how do you go about that?
You're not really investigating how they've applied their statutory powers. It's about how they have delivered their service. So it's actually, you are able to differentiate. I think this next statement probably comes in the frank at the end of service box, but I'm not sure that parliamentary office holders should be in my jurisdiction. If they weren't, I think it's a different mindset about the way that we might work together, the rights-based organisations, certainly. I think if you look at Ethical Standards Commissioner, for example, that because the Information Commissioner, it's more about how they've delivered the services. It's not about the decisions they've taken. And that is true of all public bodies. We won't tell a local authority they've made the wrong planning decision, but we will look at the process that led them to that planning decision, because if there was no fault or maladministration, that's their job. That's why they're there, to make those decisions. But I think it's something that's probably worth exploring further with the parliamentary office holders.
Okay, thank you. And if you have any further thoughts on that you want to potentially follow up in writing in due course, that would be very helpful. Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Ashley again. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to cover with you issues around accountability and scrutiny mechanisms. So in your submission to the committee, you have set out the various different interactions between those scrutiny mechanisms. Can you explain a little bit about those for us and how you think they work together, and if you think they are effective and robust?
So I am broadly accountable in 2 ways. I think I'm accountable in terms of my statutory duties as the Ombudsman, but I'm also accountable as an accountable officer in the same way that any other public body would be. So I am accountable through the finance manual. In terms of the scrutiny of my Ombudsman type work, we are scrutinised by the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. That's historic from when we were local government. But actually, we don't just appear before them once a year. We will send them a 6-month update. We will answer questions. We will look at specific themes if there is a question about that. So a good example was, when there was all the issue with mould, are you tracking it? We are now, type thing. We still are. And I think that element of it works well because in order to prepare for going to speak before committee, give evidence, it's a really good opportunity for you as an organisation to have some self-reflection. Because I don't want to go into these things being defensive. If there was an area that we were challenged on, then I think it's right that we go away and think about that. And so for me, that side of it works really well. I'm less certain about the challenge we get or the scrutiny of the link between our performance and budget. So coming back to the KPI, I know that for the year just coming to the end of, the chances are that we're going to miss one of our KPIs, and we know why that is. But we would need in an accountable officer type context to be able to say what the reasons were. You were given this budget, you did not achieve this KPI, what are the reasons? There are very good reasons. Not defensive reasons, just very good reasons. So I think that side of it is maybe something that we could think about differently. Obviously, we have to submit our budget bids and contingency fund bids and explain why we need the money we need. But at the other end of it, we do have an audit advisory board. That's a shared service with Parliament. We do go through external audits, and that's an area you could save some money if the rules were a bit different between the office holders. But I think in terms of that question, the link between performance and budget is not really what I would expect the local government or any other subject-based committee to be doing in quite that same way. So I think there's potential there.
So you mentioned the local government committee. They were holding additional scrutiny sessions, as I understand it, and they were in those cases involving, academics and additional organisations. Can you say if you think did that approach improve the scrutiny there, and what else do you think we could be doing in terms of, to improve the level of scrutiny and accountability?
I actually feel that through that committee that scrutiny was appropriate. I'm not sure that necessarily by the time it got translated into questions it added a huge amount, but it certainly, I think, is calling for public evidence in that way. I don't have preference one way or another, but as a citizen, I like the idea that I could go and give my evidence as a citizen if I've had an experience with a particular office holder. In terms of the effect for us, I think some of it actually was quite reassuring in a way, because what Professor Gill was saying, for example, what he was basically saying was we should get service user feedback more widely. And in fact, we'd taken on board something that had already been said, and we were in the middle of reviewing how we did that and have relaunched it. So it was quite reassuring that something an academic was saying is something we're already doing. I think where it is perhaps more helpful is for the committee themselves, because they hear from a wider group of voices.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. And I'll just bring Richard Leonard back in a second. But you talked about, you mentioned there about how currently all office holders are individually audited, and that there could be a potential saving if there was an opportunity for doing one audit for all office holders. Are there any challenges or opportunities that you see in potentially doing that you might want to highlight to us today, or as a follow-up if that's more appropriate?
I think there's two things at play. One is it's within our legislation that our accounts are audited and we are the accountable officers, or somebody in our organisation is. And I'm not sure that technically, I'd have to ask an auditor that. I'm not sure technically you could have different accountable officers all through the same audit. Although the amount, and I can't remember the exact figure, that I know we pay for external audit. If I'm honest, the galling bit is we are one line item of a very small amount collectively of the Parliament's budget. So individually we're audited, then the parliamentary corporate body will look at what we're doing, then the Finance Committee will look at it, and Parliament's accounts are audited. So you've got a lot of money being spent on audit. But one audit is maybe not the only way of looking at this. The other way of looking at is actually the audit costing model. Because I think particularly reflecting back on Information Commission, we're a small organisation, and it's often the amount you have to pay is disproportionate for the size of your accounts and budgets. So something I would also be looking at is whether there could be a discussion with Audit Scotland about the auditing model. The concept of audit, I think, is really critical in terms of accountability, though, because it enables me as an accountable officer to be aware of if there are any issues, which for us, our audits go well, we don't. But it also is a form of assurance, and it's part of your assurance and scrutiny that you are audited. We also get some good advice from our audit advisory boards, and so I think the actual concept of having the audit is actually a very helpful one in accountability terms.
That's very helpful, and we'll have Audit Scotland giving evidence to us as well, so you've given us some potential information that we may want to raise with them. Richard Leonard, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I declare an interest as the convener of the Public Audit Committee. I mean, it seems to me, I'm not quite sure whether where you finished up was the same place as where you started, because you seem to be suggesting, quite rightly in my view, that external audit by Audit Scotland gives you a certain validation. I mean, your last audit, I think, said it was an unmodified opinion and accounts, regularity in expenditure and income, you were working effectively. I mean, these are all positive things. The converse of that, of course, is last week we had in the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life, and 2 years ago they were the subject to a Section 22 report because of major failings in the organisation. So don't you think that external audit function is extremely valuable, both in highlighting what's working well and identifying where things are not working well at all?
I do, I absolutely do. I think it's the model of how it's done, whether you have one audit that's all of us, or we look at the relative costs that we're all paying for that individual audit. I think you can't achieve the one single audit without a legislative change, I don't think. But I do think there is scope for looking at the amount of money that is spent on gaining the assurance for the relative budget size.
You mean the fees that are charged?
Yeah.
Well, that's a different question, isn't it?
It is, but it is actually what prompts the discussion often is when you look collectively at how much is spent on external audit by parliamentary office holders, and then that's part of an account for Parliament that's also audited. You look at the cost and think there's those layers of audit, but actually I agree with you. I think for an office holder the audit is an important accountability. If I'm honest, I just think we have to spend too much on it.
That might be the price of the audit might be a separate point to the organisation of the audit, but that's
Auditing audits.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we will consider that further.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Lastly, I was curious. You talked earlier, and Richard Leonard raised a point about other ombudsman functions reserved and devolved, and I just and this is just a point of curiosity more than anything else, but are there any cyclical moments through the calendar year where you sit round a table together or have a call or the government convenes? Because there must be so much opportunity for shared insight and learning, and it is a cluttered landscape, and that's partly why we've been charged with this work in terms of the Scottish Parliament corporate body. But I'd just be interested. How do you collaborate, communicate on a wide scale?
Okay, so the Public Service Ombudsman across the UK, so myself, Northern Ireland, Wales, Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, PHSO, Housing Ombudsman, we will meet periodically. It's 2 or 3 times a year, and at those, they are a really good opportunity, both in terms of a resilient support network, but also in discussing common themes. So the volume of complaints rising, we're all experiencing the same thing to different degrees. We also will use those opportunities to discuss and just, I was going to say nick good ideas from each other, but if there's a good idea and you think it will work and help you with efficiencies, and likewise share what we're doing. We're not directly comparable. We're probably closer to Northern Ireland and Wales because we have a very diverse jurisdiction rather than being almost single subject. But those are really valuable groups. And our offices also talk to each other. If we want to know what somebody's HR policies are, we might ask them when we're reviewing ours, so we've got something to compare it to. We also interact with the Ombudsman Association. That's a slightly different entity that covers private sector ombudsmen as well, but certainly through some of the special interest type groups, we will look at things like first contact. Are we all experiencing the same type of issues? What are we all doing about it? So it's very much a collegiate approach. We all know we do something ever so slightly different. Our jurisdictions are slightly different. But on top of that, we will also, sometimes we'll get approached by a different parliament or government. So we've been asked before, for example, I've given evidence to the Senedd, and I would expect us to do again if asked. And I think from your perspective as Parliament, probably hearing from them is quite a good way to hear about what's going on. But certainly, I would say we are actively in contact with each other.
I mean, that's helpful, and you talked earlier about how there's many of you in British South House in my constituency, and that creates almost organic dialogue and sharing of insights. But I mean, what about things like the park and the care inspectorate? I mean, are you ever in dialogue with them?
We
No.
talk to everybody. No,
Yeah.
we don't talk. We are, particularly, where our functions may abut towards each other or slightly overlap. So the care inspectorate's a good example of where, if it's a private care home, it's their jurisdiction. If it's a local authority-owned care home, it's our jurisdiction. But we have to talk to each other because we want to make the landscape work. So that, I think, requires... It's 2 different types of stakeholder analysis. Some of it is analysing how you contact your service user stakeholders, third sector, and we're doing a lot more with trying to contact and have interaction with the third sector because they're often the ones that are representing those who do and don't complain. I think the other thing we do is, for example, we're members of the Sharing Intelligence for Health and Care Network, I think they're called, and that's about triangulation of either data or identifying areas of risk or trend, because something our complaints are telling us may not be other oversight bodies' experience. So I think, it happens both proactively and reactively, but I think it's also part of the recognition that we all have that we need to be aware of what each other are doing. And we will ask, other organisations for things. They'll ask us, and we do as much as we can.
Okay, that's very helpful. Colleagues, any further questions that you'd like to ask? Commissioner, Ombudsman, sorry. Is there anything that you would like to say that you haven't had a chance to say in answer to any of our questions?
No, I think we've explored things, and you've had our written submissions. I don't envy you having to pull all of these different office holders' submissions together, but other than if you have any additional questions, you're very welcome to write to us, and we'll get back to you in writing.
Well, thank you very much, Rosemary Agnew, for your time today and for sharing your insights and answering our questions. The next meeting will be after recess, colleagues, and the committee will hear from the Scottish Information Commissioner and the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner. But we now conclude the public part of our meeting today, and as previously agreed by the committee, we move into private session to consider today's evidence. Thank you.